Imagine a map, not a clean, modern map with neat borders and labeled highways. A weathered, salt-stained chart stretched across a captain's table somewhere in the Caribbean, circa 1715. The ink is faded, the edges are torn. And scattered across it, from Nassau to Port Royal, from Tortuga to the coast of West Africa, are dozens of tiny skull markers. Each one represents a known pirate anchorage. Each one represents a place where men missing fingers, hands, legs, and eyes gathered to drink, fight, and plan their next raid. Now zoom out. Pull the camera back until that map becomes one of hundreds. Charts covering the Atlantic, the Indian Ocean, the South China Sea. Because piracy wasn't some isolated Caribbean hobby, it was a global industry. And the men and women who worked in that industry paid for it with their bodies in ways that would make a modern emergency room surgeon flinch. We've all seen the image. The pirate with the hook for a hand, the wooden peg leg, the black eye patch. It's Halloween costume material. It's a cartoon. It's Captain Hook chasing Peter Pan around Neverland while a crocodile ticks somewhere in the background. But here's what nobody tells you about those images. They weren't invented by Disney. They weren't dreamed up by Robert Louis Stevenson. They came from something real, something brutal, something that happened so frequently on pirate ships that crews actually developed insurance policies to compensate men for their lost limbs. That's not a joke. Pirates had disability compensation before most governments did. This is the story behind piracy's most famous injuries. And it's a lot uglier, a lot more painful, and a lot more fascinating than anything you've seen in a movie. Let's start with the leg. The wooden peg leg is probably the single most recognizable pirate image in history. Long John Silver in Treasure Island. Captain Ahab in Moby Dick. The entire visual language of piracy is built around the idea of a man stumping around on a carved piece of wood where his leg used to be. But the reality of losing a leg at sea in the 1600s or 1700s was nothing like fiction. It was, by almost every account, one of the most horrifying medical experiences a human being could endure. Here's how it usually happened. A cannonball. That was the most common cause. During a naval engagement, ships would fire broadsides at each other from distances as close as 50 yards. The cannons used by pirate ships and naval vessels alike fired iron balls weighing anywhere from 4 to 24 pounds. When one of those balls hit a wooden deck, it didn't just punch a hole, it sent an explosion of wooden splinters in every direction. Splinters the size of your forearm, traveling at the speed of a musket ball. These splinters were arguably more dangerous than the cannonball itself. A cannonball might kill one man instantly. The splinter shower could wound a dozen. And the most common wound? Shattered legs. A 6-inch shard of oak hitting your shin at 300 feet per second doesn't just break the bone. It pulverizes it, turns it into fragments, shreds the muscle tissue around it, severs blood vessels, embeds itself so deep into the wound that no surgeon alive in 1715 could have extracted all the pieces. There's a detail about naval combat that rarely gets mentioned. The guns on these ships weren't just firing solid iron balls. They were also firing chain shot, 2 balls connected by a length of chain designed to spin through the air and tear through rigging and sails. They fired bar shot, which was basically a heavy iron dumbbell that tumbled end over end. And they fired grape shot, which was a canvas bag full of musket balls that turned a cannon into a giant shotgun. When grape shot hit a crew at close range, it was a massacre. Men were cut in half, limbs were torn away. The deck would be so slick with blood that survivors couldn't stand. One account from a captured merchant sailor describes the aftermath of a pirate broadside. He said the deck looked like a slaughterhouse floor, body parts scattered everywhere, men crawling toward the hatches dragging limbs that were barely attached. The sound, he said, was the worst part. Not the cannons, the screaming afterward, and that's assuming you survived the initial impact. Many men bled out on the deck before anyone could reach them. Blood pooled in the scuppers and ran out the drain holes, turning the waterline red. The ones who didn't bleed out faced something almost worse. The ship's surgeon, Now, calling them a surgeon is generous. On most pirate ships, the surgeon was whoever happened to know the most about cutting things. Sometimes, it was an actual trained barber surgeon who had studied in London or Paris. More often, it was the cook, or the carpenter, or just whoever had the steadiest hands and the strongest stomach. The procedure for a shattered leg was straightforward in theory. You had to amputate above the damage. If the shin was destroyed, you cut at the knee. If the knee was destroyed, you cut at the thigh. The tools were simple. A tourniquet, usually a leather strap twisted tight with a wooden rod, a knife to cut through the skin and muscle, and a bone saw, which looked exactly like the kind of saw you'd use to cut a piece of timber, because that's often exactly what it was. There was no anesthesia, not in the modern sense. The best a pirate could hope for was a bottle of rum and something to bite down on. Before we go any further, I need to stop for a second, because what I've been showing you in these videos only scratches the surface. And I realized at some point that the full picture, the actual pirate code, word for word, the real punishment records, the exact treasure division shares, the ports that secretly funded them, it doesn't fit in a video. I put it all into one document, the Black Flag Codex. It's linked below, and the QR code is on your screen. Now, let's keep going. Some accounts mention a leather strap between the teeth. Others mention a wooden dowel. One account from a French buccaneer surgeon named Alexandre Exquemelin describes simply having two men hold the patient down while a third poured rum down his throat until he stopped screaming. The actual cut took anywhere from 30 seconds to 3 minutes, depending on the surgeon's skill. The fastest surgeons in the Royal Navy could remove a leg in under a minute. Pirate surgeons, with less training and worse tools, typically took longer, and every additional second meant more pain, more blood loss, and a higher chance of the patient going into shock and dying on the table. After the leg was removed, the stump had to be sealed. The standard method was cauterization. A flat piece of iron was heated in the ship's forge until it was white hot, then pressed directly against the raw stump. The sizzle, the smell, the screaming. Sailors on nearby ships reported hearing it across the water. Some surgeons used a slightly more sophisticated method. They would pull the major blood vessels out of the stump with a hook, then tie them off with thread. This technique, called ligation, had been known since antiquity, but was unreliable with the crude thread available on a ship. The ligatures often slipped, or rotted, or introduced infection. Many men who survived the surgery itself died days or weeks later when their tied-off arteries reopened or gangrene set in. The mortality rate for major limb amputation at sea during the Golden Age of Piracy was somewhere between 40 and 60%. That means roughly half the men who went under the saw didn't survive. The ones who did survive faced a different problem. How do you function on a ship with one leg? The answer, for most, was the peg leg. And it wasn't the neatly carved wooden prosthetic you see in movies. It was typically a section of a broom handle or a piece of spare timber from the ship's stores, shaped roughly to fit the stump and strapped on with leather. It was uncomfortable. It chafed. It caused sores that got infected in the damp, filthy conditions below deck. And it made climbing the rigging, which was a fundamental part of a sailor's job, essentially impossible. A pirate who lost a leg was, in practical terms, done as a working sailor. He couldn't climb. He couldn't run across a deck during combat. He couldn't haul lines or work the capstan. He was, by the standards of his profession, disabled. But disabled didn't mean useless. Not on a pirate ship. Men with peg legs were often reassigned to roles that didn't require mobility. Some became navigators, hunched over charts and compasses, while the able-bodied men worked the sails above them. Some became gunners, sitting beside a cannon for hours, maintaining it, loading it, and firing it when the time came. You didn't need two legs to light a fuse. Some became quartermasters, managing the ship's stores and distributing provisions. And a few, the ones with natural authority, became captains. Because on a pirate ship, the captain was elected by popular vote, and what mattered wasn't whether you could climb a mast, it was whether the crew trusted your judgment under fire. François Leclerc, a French pirate who operated in the mid-1500s, was known as jambe de bois, wooden leg. He lost his leg in battle and kept raiding for years afterward, commanding fleets and sacking entire towns across the Caribbean. His peg leg didn't slow him down. If anything, it enhanced his reputation. A man willing to keep fighting after losing a leg was a man other pirates wanted to follow. And this is where pirate culture did something genuinely remarkable. They compensated him for it. The Articles of Agreement, which were the written contracts that pirate crews signed before every voyage, included specific compensation schedules for injuries sustained in combat. These articles varied from crew to crew, but the general structure was consistent across the Caribbean pirate fleets of the early 1700s. Captain Bartholomew Roberts, one of the most successful pirates in history, had articles that specified 600 pieces of eight for the loss of a limb. Captain George Lowther's articles specified 150 pounds for the loss of a leg. Captain John Phillips offered the same amount. Edward Lowe's crew agreed on 600 pieces of eight for the loss of a right arm and 500 for the loss of a left. Think about that for a second. These men, who we think of as lawless savages, had a more comprehensive disability compensation system than the Royal Navy they were fighting against. British sailors who lost limbs in service to the Crown received either nothing or a pittance from the Greenwich Hospital Fund, which was notoriously slow to pay and often ran out of money entirely. Pirates, by contrast, paid immediately, from the shared plunder, before anyone else took their cut. The injured man got his compensation off the top. This wasn't charity, it was pragmatism. Pirate crews were democracies. Every man had a vote. And no man was going to vote to risk his life in combat if he knew that losing a leg meant losing everything. The compensation system existed because it had to. Without it, no sane person would board a ship knowing that a single cannonball could leave them crippled and destitute. Now let's talk about the hook. The hook hand is maybe even more iconic than the peg leg. Captain Hook is literally named after his prosthetic. The image of a gleaming steel hook where a hand used to be has become so embedded in pirate mythology that it's practically assumed to be common. It was, but not for the reasons you think. Losing a hand at sea happened in two primary ways. The first was combat. Cutlass fights were close, vicious, and short. Pirates boarding a merchant vessel would swing heavy blades at anything that moved. Defensive wounds to the hands and forearms were extremely common. A cutlass could take off 3 fingers in a single stroke. A full swing could sever a hand at the wrist. The second way was the rigging. Sailing ships had miles of rope running through blocks and pulleys under enormous tension. If a line ran free while you were handling it, it could strip the skin off your palm in an instant. If your hand got caught in a block while a sail was being raised, the mechanical force could crush every bone from your wrist to your fingertips. And if a line snapped under load, the whipping end could take off anything in its path. The treatment for a destroyed hand was the same as for a destroyed leg. Amputation, same saw, same tourniquet, same screaming. The only advantage was that the arm had fewer major blood vessels, so the mortality rate was lower, roughly 30 to 40% compared to 40 to 60 for legs. Recovery was also faster. A man with a healed arm stump could return to limited duty within weeks. He couldn't climb rigging effectively, but he could steer, navigate, load cannons, and fight. A hook, when one was available, made him even more functional. But the hook itself wasn't the elegant prosthetic of fiction. Most pirates who lost hands didn't have hooks at all. They simply had stumps. The men who did get hooks typically had them made by the ship's blacksmith or carpenter. It was a piece of curved iron attached to a leather cup that fit over the stump, held in place with straps. It was crude, it was heavy, and it was genuinely useful. A hook could grip a line, it could hold a belaying pin, it could brace against a railing for stability in rough seas, and it could, in a pinch, serve as a weapon. There are accounts of pirates using their hooks in close combat, which must have been absolutely terrifying for the person on the receiving end. Imagine fighting a man who doesn't just have a sword. He has a permanent iron claw on his other arm that he's entirely willing to drive into your face. There's a reason Captain Hook became such an enduring villain in fiction. Stop for a second. What you just heard about the pirate code is the part that rewrites everything you thought you knew. But it only lands when you see the actual shares, the exact fractions written into the Articles of Agreement, the punishments, the port records, the names of the men who funded them from government offices. It's all in the Black Flag Codex, linked in the description. 5 seconds. Grab it now, because what comes next builds directly on it. Link is below. QR code is on your screen. The hook is primal. It taps into something deep in the human fear response, this idea of a person so damaged that the damage itself has become a weapon. A hand is human. A hook is something else entirely. And the real pirates who wore them understood that psychological power. Some of them polished their hooks before boarding raids. They wanted the metal to catch the light. They wanted the merchants on the target ship to see it coming and know exactly what kind of men they were dealing with. But the hook was also a constant reminder of what this life cost. Every time that man looked down at the curved iron where his fingers used to be, he saw the price he'd paid. And every young sailor who looked at that hook saw what might happen to them on the next raid. Now, the eye patch. This is where things get interesting, because the popular explanation you've probably heard is actually a myth. You've seen the claim floating around the internet. Pirates wore eye patches to keep one eye adjusted to darkness, so when they went below deck during a raid, they could flip the patch up and see in the dark. It sounds brilliant. It sounds clever. And there is zero historical evidence for it. The Mythbusters tested it and confirmed the technique works from a vision science perspective. Your dark-adapted eye does give you an advantage in low light, but not a single primary source from the Golden Age of Piracy mentions this practice. Not a pirate account, not a naval record, not any court testimony from the hundreds of pirate trials that took place in the early 1700s. The real reason pirates wore eye patches was much simpler and much grimmer. They were missing eyes. Eye injuries at sea were devastatingly common. The same splinter showers that shattered legs also destroyed eyes. Flying debris during combat, from cannonballs hitting wood to musket balls ricocheting off metal, turned the deck into a shrapnel zone. Rope ends whipping free could strike a face with enough force to rupture an eyeball. Gunpowder flash from a cannon could blind the man standing next to it. And then there was the deliberate damage. During boarding actions, pirates fought at arm's length with cutlasses, daggers, pistols, and bare hands. Gouging, biting, and clawing were all considered acceptable combat techniques. More than one pirate trial transcript mentions eye injuries inflicted deliberately during hand-to-hand fighting. It was dirty, it was savage, and it was standard. An eye once lost couldn't be replaced. The surgeon's only role was to clean the socket and keep it from getting infected, which, given the sanitary conditions on an 18th century ship, was almost impossible. Most empty eye sockets developed infections. Some developed into abscesses that spread to the brain, which was fatal. The men who survived were left with a hollow, scarred socket that was painful and disturbing to look at. The eye patch served a practical purpose. It kept dirt, salt water, and rope fibers out of the empty socket. It reduced the chance of reinfection, and it spared the rest of the crew from having to look at the wound while they were eating dinner. There's an account from the trial of pirate William Fly in 1726, where a witness described one of Fly's crewmen removing his patch during an interrogation. The witness said the empty socket was a hole of corrupted flesh that made the magistrate turn away. The pirate reportedly laughed and put the patch back on. He'd been living with that wound for over a year. To him, it was just part of his face now. To everyone else in the courtroom, it was evidence of a life lived in conditions that civilized society could barely imagine. It was not a fashion statement, it was a medical device. But those three injuries, the leg, the hand, and the eye, were only the most visible forms of damage that pirate life inflicted. There was a whole catalog of slower, less dramatic ways that the sea destroyed a man's body. Scurvy was the big one. We think of scurvy as a historical curiosity, something that happened before people figured out that citrus fruit prevents it. But during the Golden Age of Piracy, scurvy was a constant, grinding horror. Long voyages without fresh fruit or vegetables caused vitamin C deficiency that attacked the body from the inside out. First, your gums would swell. Then they'd start bleeding. Then your teeth would loosen and fall out. Old wounds that had healed years ago would reopen. Bruises would appear spontaneously across your body. Your joints would ache so badly you couldn't stand. Your skin would turn yellow and dry. Your hair would fall out. And if the voyage lasted long enough, you'd start bleeding internally. Your organs would fail one by one, and you'd die. Captain Woodes Rogers, the privateer who later became governor of the Bahamas and spent years hunting pirates, recorded that during his circumnavigation of the globe, scurvy killed more of his men than combat, storms, and accidents combined. On some voyages, up to half the crew died of the disease before reaching port. Pirates were slightly better off than naval sailors in one respect. They raided frequently, which meant they had more opportunities to acquire fresh food from captured ships. But between raids, on long passages across open ocean, they suffered just as badly as anyone else. Then there were the tropical diseases: malaria, yellow fever, dysentery. The Caribbean was a disease environment that European bodies were catastrophically unprepared for. Port Royal, Jamaica, one of the major pirate havens of the 17th century, had a mortality rate that made London during plague years look healthy. Sailors who survived combat and scurvy could still be killed by a mosquito bite within days of making port. Yellow fever was particularly terrifying. It came on fast: high fever, headache, muscle pain, then jaundice, which turned your skin and eyes yellow, giving the disease its name. Then, in severe cases, you started vomiting blood. The vomit was black because the blood was being digested by your stomach acid before you threw it up. They called it the black vomit. And when a man started producing it, everyone on the ship knew he was going to die. There was no treatment. There was no cure. There was only quarantine, which on a small ship was essentially impossible, and prayer, which was generally ineffective. Dysentery was the other constant killer. Contaminated water, spoiled food, rats in the food stores, it all contributed to outbreaks that swept through a crew in days. The symptoms were relentless: severe dehydration, bloody diarrhea, cramping so intense men doubled over and couldn't move. On a ship with no toilet except a plank with a hole in it hanging over the side, and no privacy except the darkness of the hold, the experience was as humiliating as it was painful. Men died lying in their own filth because there weren't enough healthy crewmates left to carry them topside. Henry, every one of the most successful pirates of the 1690s, reportedly lost a third of his crew to disease on a single voyage down the coast of Africa before he ever engaged a single enemy ship. The men who survived were so weakened that every had to delay his planned raid by weeks while they recovered. Disease didn't care how good a fighter you were. It didn't care how many cannons you had. It killed captains and cabin boys with equal indifference. And then there were the injuries that came not from combat or disease, but from the sheer physical brutality of working a sailing ship. Hernias from hauling heavy lines and lifting cargo. Crushed fingers from handling anchor chains. Burns from cooking fires that rolled across the galley in rough seas. Broken ribs from falling off the rigging. Concussions from booms swinging across the deck. Frostbite in northern waters. Heat stroke in southern ones. Chronic back pain from sleeping in hammocks for years. Hearing loss from standing next to firing cannons. The average pirate's body was a roadmap of accumulated damage. Scars on top of scars. Missing teeth from scurvy or fistfights. Fingers bent at wrong angles from breaks that healed without being set. Chronic infections that never fully cleared because the conditions below deck were essentially a bacteria farm. Alexandre Exgamelin, the French buccaneer surgeon who sailed with Henry Morgan, described wounded men lying in the hold of the ship in conditions that would horrify a modern veterinarian. No clean bandages, no antiseptic. The wounds were cleaned with seawater, which introduced salt and bacteria. Poultices were made from whatever was available: tar, tobacco, even gunpowder mixed with spit. The men who recovered did so in spite of their treatment, not because of it. The gunpowder remedy deserves special mention because it was genuinely widespread and genuinely disturbing. Sailors believed that packing a wound with gunpowder and then igniting it would cauterize the wound and prevent infection. The theory was that the flash of flame would burn away the corrupted flesh. The practice was that it introduced additional burns, embedded unburned powder granules in the wound, and caused excruciating pain while doing almost nothing to prevent infection. But they kept doing it, because when your only alternatives are gunpowder and dying, you choose gunpowder. There's one more aspect of pirate injuries that rarely gets discussed, and it might be the most important one: the psychological damage. We have very few first-hand accounts of pirates' mental states because pirates didn't keep journals. But we have court testimony. We have trial records. And what emerges from those records is a picture of men who were, by modern standards, profoundly traumatized. Pirate Bartholomew Roberts, known as Black Bart, was described by captured sailors as a man who dressed immaculately, drank only tea, and flew into violent rages without warning. Edward Teach, Blackbeard, was known for tying lit fuses into his beard during combat to make himself look like a demon. Charles Vane was described as alternating between cool calculation and blind fury. These behavioral patterns, the hypervigilance, the explosive anger, the obsessive rituals, are textbook symptoms of what we'd now call post-traumatic stress. Consider what these men experienced on a daily basis. They had watched friends die on operating tables made from upturned barrels. They'd held down screaming shipmates while a surgeon sawed through bone, feeling the vibration travel through the man's body and into their own hands. They'd smelled burning flesh when the cauterizing iron was applied. They'd been in point-blank combat where the man standing next to them was decapitated by a cannonball. They'd seen the ocean turn red around a sinking ship and heard the cries of men who couldn't swim as they drowned within earshot. They'd endured storms that lasted days, where every minute felt like it might be the last. And then they went back to port, drank themselves unconscious, and did it all again. The romanticized version of piracy, the swashbuckling adventure on the high seas, strips all of this away. It removes the gangrene and the screaming and the black vomit and replaces it with Johnny Depp in eyeliner. And here's the final irony. The men who lived this life, who endured all of this damage, mostly did it because the alternative was worse. The British Navy in the early 1700s was, by many accounts, more brutal than piracy. Naval sailors were often pressed into service against their will. They were paid less than pirates. They were flogged for minor infractions. They were fed rotting food. Their officers could beat them or even kill them with little consequence. Pirate ships, for all their violence and danger, were in many ways more democratic, more egalitarian, and more humane than the legitimate navies they fought against. Pirates elected their captains. Pirates voted on where to sail. Pirates shared their plunder more or less equally. And pirates, as we discussed, compensated their wounded: the hook, the peg leg, the eye patch. These weren't just symbols of pirate danger. They were symbols of a system that, however imperfectly, took care of its own. A man who lost his leg in service to a pirate crew got paid. A man who lost his leg in service to the king got a pension application that might be processed in 3 to 5 years, if he was lucky. That doesn't make piracy noble. These were violent criminals who robbed and murdered for a living. But it does complicate the picture considerably. Consider this. When the pirate Samuel Bellamy captured the merchant vessel Whydah in 1717, he gave a speech to the captured captain that was recorded in court testimony. He told the captain that he and his men were Robin Hoods of the sea. He said that the only difference between a pirate and a king's officer was that the pirate was honest about being a thief. The officer, Bellamy argued, robbed the poor under the cover of law and called it taxation. The pirate, at least, had the decency to rob the rich and split the take. Was Bellamy being sincere? Probably not entirely, but the sentiment captured something real about why men chose piracy despite the physical toll. The legitimate world offered them nothing. Not fair wages, not medical care, not disability compensation, not a single vote in how they were governed. The illegitimate world of piracy offered all of those things, wrapped in violence and danger and the ever-present possibility of a noose. The men wearing those hooks and peg legs weren't cartoon villains. They were working men, often from the very bottom of society, who had been chewed up by a brutal world and found their own brutal way to survive in it. The next time you see a kid at Halloween stumping around on a plastic peg leg with a plastic hook and a plastic eye patch, remember what those things actually represented: not adventure, not treasure maps and parrots. They represented cannonballs and bone saws and screaming below deck and gunpowder packed into open wounds. They represented a world where losing a limb was just another Tuesday, where the ship's cook doubled as the ship's surgeon, where your disability compensation came from stolen gold distributed democratically by a vote of thieves. That's the real story behind piracy's most famous injuries, and no movie has ever gotten it right.